Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Blake Johnson. In this week's episode, we'll discuss what happened, or perhaps what didn't happen in Congress at the end of last year, and think about what's in store for immigration in 2022. We're joined by BPC fellow Casey Christine Higgins. She's senior counsel at Akin Gump and was assistant for Policy and Trade Counsel to former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan. And as always, we'll be joined by BPC regular Theresa Cardinal Brown to help break down the latest trends in immigration. Lots to come, so stick around. Welcome back. We're happy to have with us today Casey Christine Higgins, who has for years had firsthand experience on the Hill with immigration and border security issues. She's here to help us look back at what happened this year in immigration and Congress and what might happen in 2022. You can follow Casey on Twitter at @CCHiggins, Higgins. Casey, welcome to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
So, Casey, the Democrats were dealt twin blows at the end of last year in their efforts to pass the Build Back Better bill. First, on December 16th, the Senate parliamentarian ruled that Plan C, immigration provisions that were attempted to be included as part of the Build Back Better provisions, for work authorization of undocumented immigrants could not be included in reconciliation. This was Democrats' third attempt to include some type of legalization in the reconciliation package. And then on December 19th, Senator Joe Manchin, who represents the necessary 50th Democratic vote to pass the partisan bill, pulled his support for the current version altogether. Although Manchin has signaled willingness to work with the White House on a new version of the bill, the chances immigration will be included in the new version seem to be slim to none, moving congressional action on immigration reform back to square one. So, Casey, why don't you give us your political analysis here? How did Democrats fare in their strategy to move immigration provisions last year?
Well, obviously not well, but I don't know that that was entirely unexpected too. I think there were two different dynamics at play here. One is the broader challenge of passing the Build Back Better legislation, regardless of immigration's place in that legislation or not. The second issue is obviously the reconciliation rules and whether immigration would be allowed to be a part of this legislation and operate under reconciliation rules. For many observers, I think we expected that there was going to be a strong headwind from the parliamentarian on being able to use this vehicle to move a lot of the immigration provisions that Democrats were seeking. Obviously, this is why they were trying different ways to thread the needle. However, at the end of the day, I think many of us expected that this was going to be an uphill battle and probably unlikely to come to fruition. That being said, I think it was something that the Democrats had to attempt to do to ensure that they could get their immigration agenda moved through. There was a lot of pressure from immigration activists and others to try to address this issue while Democrats have unified government. And I think they needed to give this an attempt before they could potentially pivot to bipartisan negotiations in earnest or some other pathway for immigration legislation. Now, the question is that they have failed. Will activists want them to pivot and try to work on bipartisan immigration, or will they simply try to get patches through executive actions in other avenues?
So, at the beginning of last year, we saw, Senator Lindsey Graham, Dick Durbin trying to work on some bipartisan rumblings on some immigration legislation. That obviously got scuttled and put on the shelf, as you said, and now they'll try and pivot here. What do you think the chances are that something can move? Obviously, 2022 is a midterm election year. Have you heard anything or thought that there was any good faith effort being put forward here? Like, where are sort of the battle lines coming out as Congress comes back from recess?
Yeah, it's a great question. And frankly, your categorization of whether there will be good faith efforts is probably very apropos. I think the earlier bipartisan talks probably were not very productive, is my understanding. And I think, stepping back for a minute, in the years, especially, since since I left Congress, but since my first, attempt at immigration reform back in 2012, 2013, 2014, I think that there was a lot more alignment between the parties than there is today. I think we have seen both the left and the right move further to the left and to the right, respectively, and that has made it a lot more difficult to find bipartisan consensus. So there were, quote unquote, bipartisan talks earlier this year. I don't think that there is a lot of common ground, and I don't think that there was really any progress at all made during those conversations. So the Democrats have now attempted to do this on reconciliation. What happens now? Unfortunately, we are in a very polarized environment, approaching an election year where Republicans are eyeing to take back the House and potentially the Senate as well, frankly, despite a tough map. I think it's just a very difficult environment for Democrats. And as we've seen repeatedly, not just on this issue, but others as well, election years make it tough to govern, particularly on tough issues. So I think you're going to have an uphill battle in 2022 anyway. In addition to that, you have to see the right and the left both agree that they're going to make some concessions. I think that their activists on both sides have made it tough to allow politicians to make any concessions towards the center to come to a compromise. And, further, I think that there's just such a drastic misalignment of priorities between the two sides. The Democrats are very much interested in finding a pathway for the undocumented at large. Republicans continue to be focused on the border. And I think, one of the difficulties here is the border is in pretty rough shape right now. We saw in November numbers that were historically, the highest we've seen. And typically in November, those numbers of border crossings start to tick down, and they haven't done that. They're actually going up at a historical rate. So, there is an argument on both sides of things that need to be done here, but, there's not a lot of forward progress and, bipartisan interest in trying to find a path forward at this point.
Well, I think I just throw out, is there anything on perhaps like workforce issues, H-1B, two options that that could get sort of an alignment of support that perhaps maybe goes under the radar as sort of part of another package, or something that they look forward to putting together in the Farm Bill later on. Just trying to think of different ways that they could do anything that doesn't require them to make a big sacrifice, but can get each side a win on something.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And frankly, as I say, this is, the furthest apart the sides have ever been. I should have put an asterisk with that and mentioned that there are actually some really good issues out there that both sides agree on. And we were able to start moving some really small bills like the Kiwi Act back before I left, to sort of try to break the logjam on some of these small, much smaller immigration issues with bipartisan support. And they exist now, and they're bigger ones, right? The Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act is one that has been around for a long time, but we've seen a lot of progress on that in recent Congresses and, moving through the Senate last Congress. In addition, you have seen bipartisan support behind healthcare workers, particularly during the pandemic. We have a shortage there. And, labor workforce issues, I think, will continue to be a topic of conversation in this election year, given where our current economy is. Whether those will trend towards an immigration conversation or not, there's a big question mark there. But there are some areas where we can agree. I think, the bigger question is, can both sides put aside their issues on, for the left on the undocumented, for the right on border, to move forward some of these other things. And we've always struggled to do that, right? It's always been no immigration unless it's all immigration. Maybe, potentially, I'm kind of pessimistic. I've heard from, frankly, a lot of folks on the Hill that this is one of the most difficult times in Congress for even bipartisan issues, right? Because there's just bad blood between both parties. And it's very, very difficult even on, the simplest of issues outside of immigration space to find common ground. So I'm skeptical, but I do think that the work that's been done on some of these other issues to forge bipartisan support, if not enough to pass laws right now, is still a really good thing for the overall debate. And the other thing that I'll say is that floating out there, as it has been for years, is still the court's action on DACA. And, the Fifth Circuit is sitting on Judge Haynen in Texas, a district court judge, his decision on DACA. It will likely be in the next 6 months, I would guess, that you're going to hear from the Fifth Circuit, and that potentially leads to a Supreme Court decision, right? Which could come, if it could come as early, I should say, as this fall, potentially next spring. But I think I'm always eyeing that as a potential impetus for action. Because if, the Supreme Court does strike down DACA, I think that there are many folks on both sides of the aisle that would like to make sure that we find some solution for the DACA kids. So will that create an opportunity to do DACA and maybe do some other things? God willing, frankly. But the timing of that is uncertain. And again, we're in an election year, so I'm not crossing my fingers for that until potentially lame duck and more likely potentially next Congress. So I think at that point we just have to hope that, there's more collegial relations in Congress between the two parties by that point.
Well, and just finally, what do you think the consequences are for not getting congressional Democrats and Republicans able to work together on these issues in any way? These are some of the longstanding issues that we on this podcast have been talking about for years, and have obviously, the issues have changed. The challenges, the need to reform our system are pretty obvious to both sides, and they acknowledge it. What does it mean for those who are caught in the middle and who are like the DACA kids, stuck with an intransigent Congress that I guess, thrives on partisanship over success of passing legislation?
Yeah, it's terrible for the economy, for starters, and it's terrible for people. With the economy, we've been dealing with this, for years, if not decades, on the ag guest worker front, on all sorts of these programs where we have people in legal limbo and our employers are not able to get the employees that they need. Yet I look at the labor shortage issues we're dealing with now, and I can't help but think, why aren't we making it possible for people to come here and work legally? They'll go back, they will, if they have a pathway to come and then to leave. And then at the same time, it creates more undocumented people. It creates more stress on the border. So it really just is bad all around. And this inaction is something that we've just allowed to continue. But, I've always thought the best border security would be fixing the legal immigration system. Let the people that want to come contribute to the economy, let them come through the door, right? I think high walls, wide gates. We don't want bad actors coming into the country, but if we let those good actors come through the door, we can focus on, drug dealers and other issues, actual issues at the border, and address our economic issues here at home. So, this is just, the longer we do this, the more undocumented there will be in our country, the harder it's going to be on border security and issues along the border, because people are trying to come by other means because they can't come through the legal system. And it's exacerbated every single year. This is no surprise, and more than anything too, it's hurting our employers, it's hurting our economy. So, same story that we've seen for decades, but I think particularly with the labor shortage issues we're experiencing right now, it will likely be more pronounced and more difficult.
So right now, Republicans are favored to take back a very heavy Congress in the election in this midterm. If that, let's say that comes to pass, are there provisions that Republicans on immigration issues would be more open to passing? Would Democrats be more open to working with them on this issue if they felt like they were sort of on the back foot in that sense and had lost unified control? Or would you expect it to be stuck in the same position until something jars it loose, like say the Supreme Court on DACA?
It's a great question. I struggle to answer it. I think I feel more pessimistic today than I have for years on this, right? I've always seen some path forward, some way for the two sides to come together. The issue just continues to be so politicized on both the left and the right. And they're, again, so far apart that it is really hard to see, are they willing to put aside the politics and the ability to play politics with this issue in order to come together for a solution? And it's going to hurt, right? It's going to hurt on both sides to compromise. That's, unfortunately what a compromise is. Right now, it's a question of political will if people want to come together. DACA could be the reason that we're able to forge ahead. But short of that, I see it very difficult because of the convergence of priorities to get both parties on the same page to accept enough of what the other side wants to forge ahead with the solution. And, even if Republicans, I think we expect they're going to take back the House. Even if they do take back the Senate, you're still going to have a slim margin is obviously the expectation. And slim margins mean you have to come together with both sides and compromise, right? And I think, in the past when we've seen immigration reform move, I think you've typically had the Senate controlled by Democrats, and you bring along, maybe a dozen Republicans or so. That's seen success in the past. It doesn't mean that that's what we're wedded to in the future, but, it's where can we go in the middle? Where's the center? President Biden, Democrat, will still be in the White House. We have to figure out how to get both sides to come to the table and make some concessions and put aside the politics of this issue to find a solution. Tough political environment. I don't know that I see that happening in 2022 for sure, but in 2023 necessarily at this point either, short of something forcing it like DACA.
If you're a member who wants to actually get something done and is willing to start working on this, what's the first step that they should take?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, and I think you're going to start seeing this, right? I do think we have some members that are growing tired of the political games, that find themselves more in the center of their party, whichever party that may be. And I think that they're going to start putting forward solutions and start forcing a conversation that says, okay, the left keeps hammering this and they're wrong. There's a pathway for bipartisanship, and the right keeps hammering this and they're wrong, and we can move forward in this way. And I think you need to have some members start speaking the facts and calling out, some of the political points that are being scored at the price of a bipartisan compromise. And, this is very much part of the problem too, is you need to explain to people what the reality of the situation is. And when you start talking about immigration, from border security to guest worker programs to legalization, all these things, it takes a long time, and there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to understand. And I think right now the public in general has not been doing a great job of trying to independently educate themselves on some of these things. So can we have members step up and start talking more productively, help educate the public, and point out how some of the political points that are being scored can be looked at in a different way, and we can find some middle ground if we start thinking about things differently and more collaboratively. Easier said than done, without question. But I'd love to see some new blood on both sides of the aisle step up and start trying to forge a different conversation about these issues, and in a different tone, frankly.
Casey, thanks for joining us on the program today. Really appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me. It's always great to be with you.
Now let's talk about other immigration news that ended 2021. Let's bring in podcast regular Theresa Cardinal Brown, who is on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Theresa, welcome back. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Blake.
All right, let's get started at the border. Migrant encounters were up 5% in November after declining for 3 consecutive months, with an uptick in unaccompanied migrant children as well. The border and its management have presented a consistent problem for the Biden administration. What do you think these numbers mean, this uptick at the border? Is it anything specific? And what might these numbers have in the way of impacting the Biden administration's ability to manage immigration in 2022?
Well, as you said, the border and the situation at the border has been a really kind of big issue, crisis problem that the Biden administration has had to deal with since day one. And I'd say it's had very mixed results in its ability to do so. 2021 year-end numbers for fiscal 2021 showed, the highest numbers we've seen in many, many years, decades. And the November numbers are interesting because the winter months, November, December, are usually a time when we see less migration at the border. So this is a counter-cyclical trend. It's too soon, I think, for us to kind of guess at why it's happening. But anytime we see something we call a counter-cyclical trend, we want to pay attention to it to see if it persists and to see if we can understand what may have happened. We don't yet have the numbers for December. If they continue on an upward trend, that's not good for the Biden administration because that means something is continuing to happen. That is continuing to push migrants north, and they are continuing to arrive at the border. As far as managing the border in 2022, again, it's unclear what tools in the toolbox the Biden administration is going to use, right? They've continued some Trump initiatives. Title 42 is still the predominant way they are managing the border. The majority of people arriving to the border are being expelled under Title 42. That has been consistent, but that percentage is declining. So more families, more unaccompanied minors are coming in. They are being allowed to process. Just in the last 2 weeks, right before Christmas, they restarted the migrant protection protocols under the court order out of Texas. That is starting in El Paso. So far, there's been a couple hundred a day that have been put in, a few thousand so far, but it's likely to grow. Just this week, some of those who were originally put in the program were brought back across to have their first immigration hearings in the United States. So we need to kind of pay close attention to how these cases are going. One thing that we know for now is that the people who are being put into MPP as opposed to being expelled in Title 42 seem to be more disproportionately not from the Northern Triangle countries, but from Nicaragua or Venezuela or Cuba or even Haiti. That may be due to agreements with Mexico on who can go into which program. Under MPP, even though they're in Mexico, their immigration process, if you will, is still on the U.S. side. If we return somebody under Title 42 to Mexico, then whatever immigration process they would have would be on Mexico to do. So that may have something to do with that agreement. It may also be that those are nationalities that the U.S. believes have a better chance at getting asylum right now. Traditionally, Cuba has been a high asylum grant country. Nicaragua, given its current situation, and of course, Venezuela. So Haiti, maybe not. We'll have to see. So again, these are the trends that we're seeing now. What will the Biden administration do in 2022? They have talked a lot about wanting to reform the entire asylum process at the border. The same week they restarted MPP, they filed an appeal to the Supreme Court to overturn the court decision, making them do it. So if they're not going to use MPP, if Title 42 is going to remain and they still want to change the asylum process, what are they going to do? We've seen so far a lot of talk about reforms and not a lot of implemented reforms. So that's really what I'm going to look for in the next year is, are they going to try to move forward on some of these changes to the system? Things like asylum officers processing asylum cases in the first instance rather than everything going to immigration court, or this idea of creating new sort of reception centers along the border for migrants. If we see actual efforts toward any of that more than talk, that would be a new development.
So, and one last trend I just wanted to key in on were the incredible numbers for unaccompanied migrant children who went through the HHS shelters. According to a nice report I saw, I believe in CBS News, was reporting on this at the end of the year, 122,000. And that is a record. And for reference, the previous records, first set in 2016 was 59,000. And then 2019, it was 69,000. Those were all records. 122,000, almost double. There's a reason why it was such a big story last year and why it was so difficult for the administration to get their hands around it. Do you think the administration has gotten themselves on better footing and able to process this? Do you think these numbers of children are going to keep arriving?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Here's what I would say. That was the original big challenge that they had at the border when unaccompanied children were coming in. Going back to 2020, remember the Trump administration was using Title 42 on unaccompanied minors. There was a court challenge to that initially said that you could not do that. So in November, unaccompanied minors were exempted from Title 42, November 2020. Then in February 2021, right after Biden came into office, the court said, no, you can use Title 42 against unaccompanied minors. The Biden administration said they would not do so by their own policy. So since they have stuck with that and they're not turning children away, we've seen these increases in numbers, these high numbers continuing throughout the year. Will it persist into 2022? It's unclear. We don't know the universe of minors that would be coming, right? Many of them are coming to join family that's already in the United States. So some of this is driven by family unification. Some of it is driven by, frankly, violence and gang oppression in these countries against young people in those countries, and that is causing them to leave. So it's kind of too soon to say how long this might persist. Have we essentially already gotten everybody we expect to come, or is there more there? I think we don't know the answer to that. What we do need to understand is that as long as they are being brought, as long as they're coming to the United States, I think the Biden administration has done better at sort of the initial reception of the unaccompanied children. We haven't seen as many people crowded into emergency shelters. The shelter system the HHS is running is moving people out of those shelters in a fairly decent clip. But we are now seeing pushback from states where those minors are ending up. So the governor of Florida saying that he wants to turn away unaccompanied minors being brought to his state. Just the last week, former Congressman Lou Barletta in Pennsylvania was taking pictures of flights arriving in Pennsylvania that he said were midnight flights of unaccompanied children being brought to the state. Now, this is political, opposition. These are Republicans who are trying to push back against the administration. But these children are coming into the United States. Their cases are adding to the immigration court backlog. And the end state for them is unknown. And I think as long as that process continues, we'll still see kids coming to the border. It's the push factors, but then also the fact that the system is allowing them to stay. And, that's a hard thing for many immigration advocates to talk about. But do we have the unlimited reason to accept people constantly just because they can get here? And I think, that's another area we're looking at what the Biden administration might do, for example, expanding processing in outside of the border. The Central American Minors Program was restarted last year, and we've heard very little about it. We don't know how many kids have been enrolled in that, if many at all. So this is another area where, are they going to do anything different? Are they going to make any major changes in policy? Absent any changes in policy, the factors that we control, I don't see things changing. That if we don't change anything on our end, the only thing that would change the numbers is changes in the sending countries, or just frankly in the number of unaccompanied minors that are looking to come north.
Well, and so on those changing demographics and compositions, the other political hot button more than numbers were the Haitian migrants, and reports from Mexican border in December showed another surge in Haitian migrants, many who have been on the move for years. What do you think the growth of migration from quote unquote other countries, including Haiti, says about large scale immigration trends in our hemisphere?
Yeah, this is something we've been pointing out in our blogs, and a good blog that we put out at the year end by Hannah Tyler looked at these trends. We have seen significant increases in non-Central American, non-Mexican migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border, including Haitians, including Venezuelans and Cubans, and now Nicaraguans, including what we call extra hemispheric migrants, people from Africa or Asia. Those populations are still relatively small. It's still mostly hemispheric migration, but Venezuela especially is a country that we're seeing much higher migration from in the last couple of months. The COVID issues in the Western Hemisphere have significantly impacted the economic viability in many of these countries for the people who are coming. Whether we're talking about, for example, for the Haitians, there's obviously political unrest and economic difficulty in Haiti itself. But these are mostly Haitians that had resettled in other countries in Latin America and now find it untenable to stay there. So it's secondary migration from Chile or Brazil. As a matter of fact, Mexico showed a very big increase in the number of Haitian asylum seekers in Mexico and an increase in Chilean asylum seekers, but most of the Chilean asylum seekers were children of Haitian immigrants born in Chile.
So what is actually, and so, the Haitians sort of seem to be a unique thing. Obviously, given the earthquake several years ago, that led to a lot of resettlement elsewhere. Yet it seems like are they just sort of coming north because they see it as potentially advantageous at this time based on how the administration is being overwhelmed? Or is it specific things in those countries that's sort of making it untenable for them to stay? I don't know if there's any anecdotal.
I think there's a couple issues. I mean, first of all, for the Haitians, they are not native Spanish speakers. Many of them are Black Caribbean people who are instantaneously identifiable in those countries where they have settled. And so there have been reports of incidences of racial violence and other discrimination on those folks in those countries. And particularly as the economy has declined due to COVID, again, as the other, if you will, in those countries, they have had a harder time. You also have seen this with regard, for example, to the Venezuelans who previously had migrated, for example, to Ecuador. And Ecuador was quite welcoming to them for a very long time, but now the Ecuadorian economy is not very good. And honestly, for most of the Western Hemisphere, coming to the United States is always like, oh, the dream, I might be able to get there, right? And when you feel like, what have I got to lose? And it seems like everybody else is going north, then that's what you do. And I think that that's where we're at right now. Everyone is coming north. And, some have gotten to the border and found it harder than they thought. And so, for example, Mexico, as I said, is seeing a significant uptick in Haitians applying for asylum there. And many Haitians who arrived at the border and found themselves turned back under Title 42, for example, are now seeking, well, maybe I can make it work in Mexico, right? So they want to try to come to the United States. And if that's not successful or they find it harder, then they may look elsewhere. But the U.S. is always the first place that people want to come.
Well, so looking at this dangerous and arduous journey, which is, so often, not really appreciated when they start this journey, the International Organization for Migration reported in December that 650 people died attempting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border in 2021. That's more than any other year since the agency began documenting deaths in 2014. Customs and Border Protection also performed 12,854 rescues this past fiscal year, the highest in 4 years, also when the agency started tracking the data. The previous high of 2019 with 5,335 rescues, just to put that 12,000 number in perspective. It seems like crossing the border is more dangerous than ever, and yet we still have these high rates crossing. What does this say about our border operations, and what does this say about our capacity to be able to safely deal with these humanitarian issues when people get into trouble trying to cross the border?
Yeah, well, first thing I will say is that crossing the border has always been dangerous. It has always been dangerous to cross the border at various times in various places. It may have seemed easier, but has always been dangerous. And the danger comes from natural things like crossing in inhospitable deserts or remote areas like in western Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. crossing the Rio Grande River, which is known to have, very fast currents sometimes. And, if you don't know how to swim and it's, they're coming across on, honestly, like blow up pool toys they're crossing on, not even real watercraft. So it's always been dangerous from that aspect, and from, the smugglers and cartels and criminals that prey on the immigrants themselves, who can leave people stranded, frankly, when they fall behind. I think the increase in numbers, you could argue it's proportional to the increase in overall crossings, right? If you have more people crossing a dangerous crossing, you will have more deaths, you will have more rescues. Is it disproportionate to the increase in overall crossings we've seen? I don't know. I haven't run the numbers on that. But what I can say, and what seems to be increasingly apparent, is that those dangers are not in and of themselves a deterrent for people to try. And the fact that we may have relied on that dangerousness in the past as a deterrent, that's no longer true. And so we need to find better ways to manage it for their safety, as well as our own humanitarian values of not having people die to come here.
Well, in being able to look at those kinds of things, our ability to respond to a humanitarian issue at hand, CBP officers, how many do we have? Are they available? Can they handle this capacity load? As I said, as you have said, this past year is unprecedented. We've just a crazy amount of people, encounters, number of children needing housing, people from all over the world sort of coming through this pathway. Where are we as far as our capacity within DHS to manage our border?
Yeah, I think I wrote about this last year, and I think it is absolutely time for us to sort of do a rethink of what we mean when we talk about border security. For most of our history, enforcing immigration at the border was a matter of catching people and sending them back to Mexico, right? It wasn't, we had a very, very small number of humanitarian issues. Yes, over time, as we've reinforced the border and made it harder to cross, we saw more deaths. CBP has responded. They have a search and rescue team. We've seen nonprofit organizations, try to help migrants. At the same time, though, we continue to treat border enforcement as if it is all about enforcement, law enforcement. And what we're seeing is really a humanitarian surge. And so we are asking law enforcement officers to treat and deal with a humanitarian flow. And that's a mismatch. CBP officers are not thrilled with having to deal with thousands and thousands of families and children. They want to be out catching bad guys. They want to be out catching the drug dealers and the smugglers that are bringing them across. And, the people who are trying to bring in contraband, the people who are evading warrants, like that's what they really care about. They don't want to see people willy-nilly crossing the border. And at the same time, treating this humanitarian flow as a law enforcement problem is really a mismatch. Because the reasons they're coming, what they're seeking, how they're being processed is not really working. So I do actually agree with the Biden administration on this, that we need to rethink how we process humanitarian asylum seekers at the border. We need to find ways for them to come in an orderly way, legally, hopefully through the ports of entry, and separate out their processing from the law enforcement border security mission that needs to also exist at the border. And I think we need to hand this, frankly, over to other people, whether that's a new office or USCIS, whether it's some combination of agencies that have the reception and processing that they're talking about. But we need to find ways to manage this flow, treat them humanely, provide the care that's needed, and adjudicate their cases fairly but rapidly. Simply letting people come into an already overburdened system and wait 3 years for a decision is frankly inviting more people to come, regardless of the push factors. So we need to fix that problem. And that's exactly what I would look at the Biden administration to say. Are you going to continue to rely on deterrence, impedance, and frankly, just turning people away? Or are you going to really look at efforts to try to change the system? Because this new paradigm of people at the border has now been with us for, 6 years, essentially, even longer. It's not going away soon, and we need to adapt to deal with it.
Well, and speaking of, processing capacity, Afghan refugees. Several months ago, the fall of Afghanistan, the evacuations, many gone to holding countries in, I believe, like the UAE, have now seen it. Before we left for the break, there were about 30,000 applicants for humanitarian parole. That number is now leapt to 35,000, with no real sign of them being processed by our immigration agencies to be able to come to the U.S. They're stuck in these holding patterns and these lily pads across, outside of the country, being kept at arm's length. What's the status for them, and is there any expectation that the government will get in gear and get these people processed for who fled Afghanistan last year?
So I will say I both feel for and am frustrated by USCIS. I feel for them in that USCIS over the last 2 years has suffered a lot of what I would call body blows to its processing. In 2020, like everyone else, they were sent home, not able to get to the offices. USCIS offices were closed for processing. They already had growing backlogs in a lot of different cases. And because USCIS, most of the types of adjudications they do are still paper-based, they were not able to transition as well to remote processing as many of us were. And there was just a DHS OIG report that came out that said essentially their processing capacity declined by half just because they had to work from home. At the same time, we had this massive evacuation. We had a slew of Afghans needing processing inside the United States now, so they diverted their already limited resources to processing the Afghans who arrived on military bases in the United States, get them humanitarian parole or their SIV applications, special immigrant visa applications, or their work authorizations, get those into the system and processed. Then we started seeing, after the final plane left Afghanistan, that those left behind and those in other countries started asking for this humanitarian parole from where they were. They were actually encouraged to do this by State Department and by USCIS. But the division that does humanitarian paroles was used to getting about 500 cases a year, and they now have 35,000. So limited capacity, increased set of applications, they were already delayed and behind. So what are we seeing now? Just in the last few weeks in December, we started hearing from attorneys and sponsors of those who are asking for humanitarian parole that some cases are being denied. And there's frustration because it was thought that this would be, it frankly is the only way for anybody who's still in Afghanistan to try to get out into the United States. They can't ask to be a refugee unless they're able to get out of Afghanistan. The refugee system itself is backlogged. And now they're being told that, unless they have really specific documentary evidence that they are personally at risk because of their work in the United States or justice concerns in Afghanistan, some of these cases are being denied. So I think that essentially that rapid, evacuation, the concern about processing them once they're in the United States, now we're seeing sort of what is the tail of that and the impact of all of those resources going up front, but it has a long tail. And there are still, we've heard as many as 60,000 Afghans still in Afghanistan that may have connections to the U.S. government or other NGOs that are trying to get out. It's still an ongoing concern for those who've been paying attention and want to help their Afghan allies. There are Afghans who are in the United States now who have relatives that they're trying to get out, and they're not able to do so. So I think that this is something that we need to pay attention to. I think, it got a lot of press at the time it was happening, but as I said, these things have a long tail, and what happens after that first initial rush of news stories is as important as what happened initially.
Yeah, well, off to a pessimistic start here to 2022. It seems like
I know
we're just
you want to think that 2022 is going to be good. Here's what I will say:
both giving me nothing but negatives.
All right, so I'll try to end on a positive note. In spite of all the negative about processing and the border and what the political space might be, we still are seeing polling that shows that Americans overall are really supportive of immigration and immigrants to the United States. And I think that's worth remembering, that for the American people, there may be a lot of frustration with the system from whatever angle you come from. But in spite of a lot of negatives, most people in America still think that immigrants can be good for our country. And so I think that's something we can build upon. And we need to try to have, I think, as Casey said, more conversations about what can be done rather than all the things that can't be done, and work from there. So that's my positive to end the podcast.
Well, Theresa, thanks as always for brightening my day a little bit in this cold, dark DC day. That's it for our show this week. One last reminder to rate, subscribe, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. I'm Blake Johnson. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and myself. Yafet Tewahada produces and edits our show this week. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you all next week.